We'll begin in just a moment, but before we get started, we'd like to let you know that the meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. The chat box is also available in case you have any perspectives you'd like to share or if you need to reach out to me for technical assistance. For those of you just joining us, welcome. You're at the session titled Key Messages from Day 4. This session will be followed immediately by a special event titled Filling the Adaptation Gap. We are ready to get started, so I will pass the floor now to Mozaharul Alam, head of the APAN Secretariat and the Regional Climate Change Coordinator at the United Nations Environment Program, Asia and the Pacific Office. Mozaharul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hermes, for introducing me. Dear participants, welcome to Day 4 Key Messages session. Focus of the day is technologies and practices. In this particular session, we will provide you a quick summary of each session happened today that includes 4 technical sessions. One on the thematic area on nature-based solution, economic resilience, local and community resilience, as well as inclusive resilience. I will be sharing with you the summary of the key messages and discussion happen on the plenary on technologies and practices. So let me begin sharing with you the key messages came out from the discussion in the plenary session on the technologies and the practices. The discussion was very rich. It was also the complex because we covered the technologies and the practices. So if we look into the discussion happen and the key points came out from the conversation, may be considered under 3 main areas. One area is what are the considerations that we need to think about when adopting technologies. The second area and third area are related to what kind of the knowledge that we need and what kind of the capacity building also necessary in advancing and scaling up those technologies. In terms of the consideration, the discussion suggested that we need to nurture and value the capital in all its dimensions, meaning that how the technology will interact with the physical, financial capital and the natural capitals, the social capitals, etc. When we are adopting the technologies, we also need to think about the nature and the innovation, which will be more fulfilling the future and move from efficiency to the sufficiencies, and also think about decoupling the growth. And when we looked into the different tools, there are already available. And in terms of the technologies, the substitution and the behavioral changes are needed also in the form of the technologies. Now, when we are going to adopt the technologies, it is also important to bring the social dimension in technology selection. And this is important to design these technologies in the context of that social dimension and the function of the human in designing those technologies and deploying those technologies. So those are important. Also, it recognizes that many technologies support both the mitigation and adaptation for addressing climate change. And when we are looking into the technologies, adoption and deployment, it is also important to think about the inclusiveness of those technologies. Obviously, for the current generation, But it is also important to give focus more on the future generation and their development. Is not only focusing on the current development and current generation. And also looking into the bottom-up approach where all solutions need to be deployed, and many solutions lies also in the bottom-up the system. And also use the people's right and the indigenous knowledge when we are looking into the different practices and deploying the technologies to address the climate change. The session also talked about the nature-based the solution, the gray-green infrastructure, and many more. But one of the things also came, which is part of the capacity building, part of the governance, in terms of the power dynamics when thinking about the different technologies to deploy. And therefore, it is important to find a powerful mechanism to let the different actors to understand their role, as well as when we are talking about the technologies related to the nature-based solution, to understand the nature of power itself too. One of the issues also came clearly, which we talked earlier in terms of the siloed approach. And when technology deployed, they also look into the particular sector and also evident that the siloed approach is still prevailing in technologies, innovation, and the deployment. So those are the things came very clearly and strongly in the technology and the practices, the high-level plenary, the session. Let me end by mentioning the two important elements as well. One is involving the local stakeholder and empowering them in the technology selection and the deployment, as well as need the partnership, as well as the opportunity to utilize the South-South and the triangular cooperation. With that, it is my pleasure to invite Albert Salamanca. He's the senior research fellow of the Stockholm Environment Institute in Bangkok office, who will be presenting the key messages and summary on the inclusive resilience, the technical session, but focusing on the technologies and practices. Over to you, Albert.
Thank you very much, Babu. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. The session is entitled Building Community Resilience by Scaling Up Women's Access to Technologies and Strengthening Voice and Leadership. It was facilitated by Mohammed Nakri, and it opened with a speech by Åsa Hedden, which is the head of development cooperation at the Swedish Embassy. She started by saying that regional approach to addressing climate change is an important priority. The people who have most to lose due to the impacts of climate change are rarely invited to the table. She also emphasized that women must have equal access to decision-making and representation at all levels and all areas. Then she was followed by Professor Jayashree Roy, who offered a keynote address and spoke about women's leadership at the core of climate change action. She said that historical development path had left women behind, but women are change makers. Women has agency to build their resilience. Technology, infrastructure, information, and training should be oriented in building their skills. But the institutions around this need to be proactive and equal in providing them. Then Shuma Datta, who works on gender and energy access, spoke about the changes in energy access have impacts on women. For instance, when women are not able to use LPG, affect their ability to provide food for the household. Women were affected seriously by the pandemic due to losses in their livelihoods. When women are economically empowered, it almost always leads to their social empowerment as well. Working with women's groups support empowerment, but leadership does not come on its own. It has to be built in the program, and mentorship is also important in enabling economic environment. And then a speaker from Vietnam, Nguyen Van An, who spoke on the specific challenges faced by indigenous women in Vietnam as they adapt to the impacts of climate change and the ongoing pandemic. Ethnic minorities remain the poorest group in Vietnam, despite Vietnam itself having improved tremendously its poverty situation. Ethnic women have more than 50% of the poverty rate. Social and gender exclusion are the primary drivers of inequality among ethnic minorities in Vietnam. Ethnic women have less rights to participate in community decision-making and have no access to technologies. For instance, in Bacan province that Empower had served, women ethnic minority accounts for 80% of agricultural labor, but only 3% of them have access to building and services. A lot of these women also are not registered, so they cannot receive support from the government, especially during COVID. And then finally, the last speaker in the panel was Buena Bernal, who is a journalist from the Philippines, who spoke about the role of storytelling in enabling change. The impacts of the stories are only possible, she said, if they are told well and not jargon heavy and generate empathy. They have to be nuanced and have solid premises. This means they have to be based on solid information. Disaggregated data therefore plays a role. The single most important success factor is user management, she emphasized. Thinking of stories that are effective and sensitive to the needs of the users. There is no single story that changed gender norms, but it is the story of many women that changed norms. Supporting women's collective social movements is therefore essential to address gender discrimination. More importantly, she ended, storytelling enables us to learn about the lives of those who are normally unheard. So the important point in the session is that women are not victims, but they are change makers. And the panelists have highlighted a number of situations wherein women have played such roles. Thank you, Babu.
Thank you, Albert, for sharing the key messages and the recommendation came in your session. Now, it's my pleasure to invite Senashia Ekanayake, Manager Program and Communication, SLYCAN Trust, the Sri Lanka, to share the summary and the key messages on the communities and the local resilience session. So over to you, Senashia.
Thank you very much, Babu. And my name is, good afternoon from a very overcast Colombo. My name is Senashia Ekanayake, and the session I report back is on inclusive community-focused adaptation efforts for sustained resilience and development. It was organized under the community and local resilience stream. The lead organizer for this session was SLYCAN Trust, but it was also co-organized by the International Center for Climate Change and Development, Regional Forestry Training Center for Asia and the Pacific, the Asia Pacific Network for Global Change and Research, and GIZ, whose long form I cannot pronounce. So the session focused on case studies on different countries across Asia and the Pacific on community-based inclusive climate action on different water-based ecosystems, from mountain ecosystems to coastal areas, the potential of ecosystems to enhance livelihood, reduce climate-related risks, and build sustained resilience for communities, as well as aspects related to vulnerable communities and multi-stakeholder engagements. Some of I would like to also maybe just provide a brief on the speakers that we had. The session was opened by Bhattacharya, the Executive Director and Attorney at Law at SLYCAN Trust. And our speakers included Dr. Klaus Schmidt, he's a Principal Advisor at GIZ, Dr. Neera Shrestha, a Senior Water and Adaptation Specialist at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, Ms. Christmas Uchiyama, the Program Officer at APAN, Mr. Lokmani Sapkota, a Program Officer at the Regional Community Forestry Training Center for Asia and the Pacific, Dr. Arthur Webb, Chief Technical Advisor on Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project, and Dr. Prem Lindo, Founder CEO of Worldview Impact Foundation. So some of the concrete solutions that were highlighted through the case studies included ensuring community rights to and access to forest resources, and communities being allowed to take part in decision making, with an example from Myanmar, restoring eroded floodplains and sustainably managed mangroves, with examples from Vietnam, using low-cost community-operated technology and using local private sector production, especially within the context of an flood early warning system that was implemented in Nepal, India, and Pakistan. Using traditional and indigenous knowledge for ecosystem-based innovations, and this was through an example in Northeast India. Community-driven rainwater harvesting technologies that benefit smallholder farmers in the Philippines, that has been also that has also been upskilled with efforts from local government. And just to maybe very briefly highlight some of the key takeaways that we had from this session. And this is a collective of all of the speakers and not particularly in relation to one speaker. So some of the key takeaways included adaptation actions should reach the most vulnerable groups of society, and they should be involved from the very beginning. An inclusive, integrated approach that involves communities, technical knowledge, and other key stakeholders through co-management or shared governance is pivotal to build sustained resilience. A sustained common vision and a pathway for the stakeholders, while ensuring that the involvement of communities and young people, as well as champions in the area, will result in communities taking ownership and as well as the sustenance of the initiative. Partnerships are mechanisms rather to connect and bring stakeholders together. While the benefits are not always equitable or fair, partners are there to resolve conflict and sustain capacity building, as well to contribute to the co-production of existing indigenous knowledge. And finally, intervention should address root causes and be built on sound understanding of the specific local conditions that will ensure access to resources and to ensure that access to resources will remain within the community. Thank you, and I hope I didn't take too much.
Thank you very much for presenting the summary. Now it's my pleasure to invite Arghya from ADB to share the key messages and the summary of the economic sector resilience session. Over to you, Arghya.
Thank you, Babu. So the session was very exciting. It was moderated kindly by a colleague from TERI. We had a keynote speaker, Professor Ian Noble, and we had 6 very exciting presentations from NGOs, private sector, community and indigenous people's voices, as well as intergovernmental organization. To keep the focus on in terms of what recommendations were, the 2 key recommendations, one around principles and second around scaling up. Now, since we're talking about economic sectors, so everything is around in the context of livelihoods and larger well-being. So in terms of the principles, the key recommendations were that technology and practice, we need a combination of high tech, and local technology, not low tech, but local technology to come together. This is critical. Number 2 is importance of partnerships, long-term partnerships between government, private sector, civil society organizations, so that people can come together and co-design solutions that can be scaled up. And number 3 is principles is the importance of ensuring that technology and practices are reaching the ones who need it the most in terms of the most vulnerable population. And this is important not just to ensure the accessibility of the information and the technology, but also to make sure the quality and the outcomes are much more sustainable. That's on the principle side. On the scaling up side, also 3 recommendations. Number 1 is looking at the entire value chain and engaging all partners in the value chain for scaling up, especially the private sector is critical. Second is around incentive mechanisms around different partners, what incentives are required for different partners to enable them to scale up. And last but not the least is a critical role of learning and the role that practitioners can play in scaling out, a successful strategies and practices. So that's very much from our side. Thank you, and over to you, Babu.
Thank you, Arghya, for presenting very succinct the messages and the recommendation covering both the principle and then what needs to be done. Now, it's my pleasure to invite Soumya Bhattacharya to share the summary and the recommendation came out from the technical session focusing on nature-based resilience. Over to you, Soumya.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Babu. And congratulations to you and the APAN team, especially Sarah and Hermes, the successful 4th day of the APAN Forum. So I'm happy to report for the session on harnessing climate technologies and practices to strengthen NBR. This session was basically led by CTCN colleagues, and the session brought together excellent set of speakers and panelists from UNESCAP, UNEP DHI, Center on Water and Environment, GIZ, the Ministry of Environment of Cambodia, and from the private sector, it was Narita Services Private Limited. And the session was moderated by CTCN as well. So this session basically explored the growing evidence that is being generated in the region on the use and effectiveness of nature-based resilience approaches, in particularly those leveraging innovation, adaptation technologies and practices. And basically, the session focused on 3 main aspects on which there was experience sharing. The learning from the region's experience in implementing climate technologies and practices for NBR that can be leveraged to address current and post-pandemic challenges. The second was major barriers and opportunities to foster wide adoption and scale up of nature-based climate resilience technologies and practices. And the third was recommendation to facilitate investment and engagement of stakeholders, including the private sector. As a part of the basic discussions, it emerged that technologies and practices for nature-based resilience could contribute as a major building block for a better society, and it can be considered as an approach to COVID-19 and post-pandemic recovery. However, more attention and efforts are required to facilitate the use of NBS and the engagement of stakeholders, including the private sector, in building nature-based resilience. So I see from other colleagues who actually just reported, and as well as this session also, it echoes the same outcomes from the other sessions as well. So let me just try to move on to the key actions and the recommendations that emerged from the session. So the first recommendation was that there is a need for action for combination of gray and green infrastructures to supplement and complement nature-based solutions. So there was a very good example of mix of mangroves and embankment for coastal zone management. So thus there is urgency for innovative technological measures and related thinking, which is required for such actions and their scaling up. The second key action that emerged at the same time, there is a need for building and using science-based data and narratives to assess effectiveness and benefits of the nature-based solutions in light of the technological evidences. The third aspect which came up was cost effectiveness and sustainability, which is basically the major benefits from implementation of NBR technologies, and is basically currently a major barrier as well. So as a key message which we can report from the session is more action and efforts to gather and share evidences of nature-based option, their effectiveness on climate change adaptation and other environmental resilience, such as on biodiversity, disaster risk reduction, etc., are required. Not only to facilitate their implementation under the current national policies and strategies, but also to attract more attention from various stakeholders, including the private sector. And finally, it is basically complemented by a message that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has brought along with unique opportunities to mobilize stakeholders to adopt and scale up nature-based climate technologies and practices to build back better. And in this, the local and community-based solutions which are very close to nature can play a major role. Apologies if I've taken more than my allotted time. All the best for your tomorrow's session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Soumya, and thank you once again, all colleagues who presented the summary of the day 4. And now it's a time for me to mention, but you will be hearing detail about the spatial event. And with that, I'd like to hand over to the technical team, specifically Am, who will be providing details about the event, specifically the spatial event that we are going to deliver as a part of the Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum, which will start probably in 15 minutes from now, or maybe a couple more minutes. So over to you, Am.
Thank you so much, Babu, and thank you to all the panelists as well for sharing today's wonderful key messages. Attendees, thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. As Babu mentioned, we will be having a special event next. It will be titled Filling the Adaptation Gap and will feature a range of panelists and speakers who will speak on the gap report and various other aspects as relevant to the event. The event will take place in this room, so you will not need to leave this room in order to join the event. You can just remain here, and we will take a 15-minute break right now. So the event will begin at 4:30 p.m. Bangkok time. So please remain in this room in order to attend the next event. Thank you once again for your participation, and see you in 15 minutes. Thank you, everyone.